Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and we have all heard about the majesty of the Carthaginian fleets, particularly during the First and Second Punic War, and we have all heard about the Greek fleets and even the fleets of Syracuse and the other sort of colonial Greek powers that then will sort of separate and even have some wars with Athens and whatnot. But what about the Roman military fleet? Well, when it comes to this topic, something you may have heard before, correct me if I'm wrong, is, oh no, the Romans were great for like military, they were great when it comes to land forces, but navy, no, it was very weak. Or you may even have heard that they had no navy whatsoever prior the First Punic War against Carthage. Well, if you have heard this, then yes, you heard a myth. So let me debunk it. Okay, so just to contextualize this even further, rather than just being a myth, this is a little bit of an educated myth. And what I mean by that is that indeed there is a specific ancient source that tells us this, and it's Polybius. Now what he tells us is that specifically before the First Punic War, Rome did not have any fleet whatsoever. They didn't have warships, they had nothing. And in fact, it was only during the First Punic War that finally they built the first Roman fleet, which resulted in about 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes as the type of warships we're talking about, or vessels. Even though the description of the fleet is rather coherent for what they had specifically against Carthage, the part that is indeed a myth is the fact that they had no fleet before that. So was Polybius wrong? Did he not know how the situation was in fact before? And my opinion is no. I think he was just being hyperbolic in the sense that he really wanted to emphasize how amazing the Romans were and how amazing the Roman Republic was when it comes to how they put together a really strong fleet that could in fact compete with the otherwise extremely advanced and experienced Carthaginian fleet or Punic fleet. But what's really crazy about this is that in order to really debunk this idea that before the First Punic War the Romans had no military vessels in the Mediterranean Sea, you know who we are going to use as a source? Polybius. Literally, we're going to use Polybius to debunk Polybius. It's wonderful. What a day. But jokes aside, it's not just Polybius. We're going to refer to Plutarch. We're going to refer to Titus Livius, Dionysius of Halicarnassus. There are quite a few Roman writers and classical writers and Greek writers that tell us so much information that really debunks this, that at the end of the day, yes, we know for a fact the Romans absolutely had a navy before the First Punic War. Now, how powerful are a navy we're talking about? Probably not that impressive, but it still debunks the idea, the statement, the categorical statement, the Romans had no military fleet nor presence in the Mediterranean basin before the clash with the Punic powers. There are two dates that are really important when it comes to placing the beginning of the Roman fleet. One is 620 BC, which would be the founding of the city of Ostia, located at the mouth of the Tiber, traditionally attributed to the fourth king of Rome, Ancus Marcius. It had a small harbour and may have been one of the first, if not the first, of Rome colonies, specifically on the coast, and it is very probable that this is where the first vessels were created in Rome. But the one date that I want to use to kind of debunk this idea is 509 BC, and Polybius himself tells us about a very important treaty that was stipulated between the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Republic. And in this treaty, the Carthaginians specifically told the Romans, you are not allowed to navigate with your vessels past the Phoenician settlement called this. That would be modern-day Gar el Mel, or the classical Rusukmona and Castradelia, modernly also known as Porto Farina, at least when it comes to the name that it got during the French protectorate in the 1800s. Now, there is a little bit of scholarly debate when it comes to this specific Carthaginian treaty. Some scholars say maybe this was a fabrication. I personally don't believe that, but it is indeed possible this wasn't just a treaty concerning the Romans, but also more extensively the Etruscans too. With that being said, what would it matter to the Carthaginians and the Carthaginian Republic? Why would they tell the Romans, oh, don't you dare go past this specific line, which is in modern-day Tunisia, with your vessels if these are not war vessels? If they have zero fleet at this point in 509 BC, why would they even care? To me, it kind of tells us that they perceived the Roman navy as a possible threat. Clearly, not as advanced as their navy, but it's interesting because this treaty was even having some clauses. For instance, you're not allowed to go past this line unless it's the weather that pushes your vessels there, or unless you you are retreating from enemies during a conflict or a naval battle. So this would be a first indicator that the Romans did have a fleet. Of course, it's a little interpretative, we can't be 100% sure, but we can be a lot more sure when we reach the 4th century BC, because by now, something really interesting happens. In 396 BC, both Titus Livius and Diodorus Siculus tell us that the Romans conquer the Etruscan city of Veii, which would be modern-day Veio, situated about 16 kilometers or 9.9 miles northwest of Rome. This was an important Etruscan center. So when the Romans do succeed with their siege and they take the city, they decide, hey, we need to thank the gods, specifically the god Apollo. So what do? Well, they take 1/10 of the booty, the loot that they captured from the city, and they decide we need to take it to Delphi. Now, how do you reach Delphi? Well, these authors, the ancient sources, tell us that the Romans use specifically a long ship, in Latin navis longa, which was a war vessel. This has been interpreted as being most likely a type of ship which was pretty large, and it had 50 oars, 25 per side, in one line. So, not a quinque remis, just to be specific. Therefore, telling us that already at this time the Romans were well equipped to go around both the Mediterranean and the Tyrrhenian Sea. Last but not least, we have mentions of Roman piracy. I know, it kind of sounds strange, but here is how that went forth. In 338 BC, the Romans managed to conquer another very important town, which is the town of Antium, modern-day Anzio in Italian. Now, this city belonged to a people called the Volsci, who are an Italic people who, even though they got conquered, still remain part of the fabric of the Roman people, to the point that it is believed that even the first emperor, Octavianus Augustus, may have had some Volscian ancestry. But that's beyond the point here. The reason why it's important that in 338 BC the Romans conquered the city is because this city was very famous, should we say infamous, for its piracy. So basically they had a very well established fleet of pirate ships. And of course, once the Romans take the city, they take the entire fleet. And that's when most likely Roman piracy begins. And in fact, this piracy is mentioned by the Greeks, occasionally clashing with the Romans. But most importantly, and that's really the fun fact in here, and once again thanks to Dr. Calenstrelli for pointing this one out to me, even Alexander the Great at times complained about Roman piracy, which kind of underlines again that yes, the Romans were in fact familiar with sea vessels, warships, and both with their piracy and their military ships absolutely had at least a decent fleet even before the First Punic War. Another interesting fun fact about this naval port is that it's actually a town that Scipio Africanus during the Second Punic War will conquer after he plunders all of the surrounding countryside in 204 BC. Now, one last fun fact that I would like to mention that you may have heard or not actually is a lot later, and it has to do with Vegetius. Now, of course, whenever we read Vegetius, we do have to take what we read with a pinch of salt, but regardless, it's still interesting to consider. Vegetius tells us about the late Republican Roman navy, specifically in Britannia. And one of the things that he says is that he mentions a specific color in connection with the Roman navy, and it's the color blue, or more specifically, Venetian blue. Now, if you look at this, it's my replica of a Roman shield, and I chose blue specifically kind of in honor of this reference by Vegetius. Now, of course, this is an imperial shield. He was speaking about the Roman Republic and their fleet, specifically in Britannia. So we don't know if by extension, when he tells us that their color was blue, both for the tunics, for the shields, and even for the ships themselves, we don't know if that was just indicative of the Roman fleet exclusively in the late Republic and maybe even exclusively in Britannia. But personally, I don't think so. I do believe that it's very possible that it was just a prerogative of the way or the colors of the Roman fleet. But one thing that he does tell us that I always find absolutely fascinating is that the reason why they chose to use blue for the navy, it wasn't just because, the sea, the navy's in the sea, so blue, duh. No, it wasn't just for that, but because it was a sort of early type or ancient version of military tactical camouflage, since he tells us that these ships with all of this blue would be harder to identify and visualize in the sea by the enemy, as they would get confused with the waves of the sea. Vegetius on the Roman Navy, Book 4. Scouting crafts, however, operate in company with the larger men of war, having about 20 rowers on each side. The Britanni call them picked boats. It is practice for surprise attacks to be made with these, for convoys of the enemy's ships to be intercepted sometimes, and for the approach of the enemy and their strategy to be found out by keeping a keen watch. So that the scouting vessels will not be betrayed by brightness, the sails are dyed Venetian blue, similar to the color of the sea, and the tackle is colored with the wax that ships are generally coated with. Also, the sailors and marine wear Venetian blue-colored clothing, so that not only at night, but even in the daytime, they more easily remain unseen while scouting. Venetian blue comes from colore veneto. We don't know 100% what this color would be exactly when it comes to the hue, but then again Vegetius does tell us that it has the same hue as the waves of the sea. Regardless of the color, once again we focus on the idea that this was done in order to escape enemy detection. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. But what about submerged resources? Did we not find ancient ships that we could identify as being Roman and date to, say, the 7th century BC? Well, surely the coast of the Mediterranean have witnessed a few shipwrecks in classical antiquity, to say the least. However, unfortunately, underwater preservation comes with several challenges for maritime archaeology. When it comes to organic tissue, within the context of corrosive saltwater, preservation becomes highly unlikely, as prolonged exposure to aquatic environments break up the cellular structure in all sorts of organic materials. Ships and their materials waste away and could only be preserved with chemical stabilization. Now, we have the tendency of considering wood as a building material, but it is a structural tissue, the nutrient-conducting tissue of trees and other plants. That is, of course, organic. Now, regardless of all the difficulties that have to do with archaeology and the preservation of material goods, it's because sometimes we do run into shipwrecks that do stand against the test of time. And this is due to highly fortuitous conditions, such as when the ships rest between large rock clusters, and then waves and currents cover the wreck with a layer of sediment deposits, which ends up creating what is called a protective anaerobic environment. Now, there is, of course, a lot more that we could speculate and talk about when it comes to the Navy, and maybe even the usage of certain types of metals rather than others. At the end of the day, we do know that, for example, in much more modern Navy, whenever cannons were used, for instance, and produced specifically for naval vessels, even in the late medieval period and in the early modern period, bronze was preferred over iron simply because, well, bronze is much better with salt water, for example, and high humidity, whereas iron would rust away. Not that iron cannons never existed. Of course they did, but broadly speaking, oftentimes bronze is the preferred metal when it comes to the Navy, at least for certain components of whatever sort of equipment and military devices are concerned. My question is then, and I have no way to back this up with any sources, but my question is, since the Romans were so tactical, so pragmatic, do you think it would be possible that specifically for the Navy, they would still arm them with iron swords, of course, and low carbon steel possibly, but maybe for the armor, the helmets, they may have used still bronze, specifically for the Navy, because at the end of the day, a bronze helmet still works really well. And of course, it's more problematic to produce, because as I was explaining on recent videos, to make iron, you just need a source or a vein of iron ore, whereas when you want to make bronze, particularly when it's tin bronze, then you need two different types of mines, one for copper, one for tin, and oftentimes these are kind of geographically very spread, and so it's more expensive at the end of the day to produce bronze. It can be more easily disrupted by enemy forces, so even from a tactical standpoint, it's easier to sort of strategically disrupt the ability of an empire or a republic or a civilization to produce bronze weapons and armor, because if they lose the control of either tin deposits or copper deposits, then they can't produce the stuff anymore. So sure, with all that being said, with all that being considered, it would be interesting to think that it would be possible that maybe they did use bronze weapons and armor still, at least maybe the helmets for the Navy, or perhaps they used orichalcum, which I know you're thinking of Skyrim now, but it is a true metal used by the Romans. We don't 100% know what it was, but it's very probable that because it would be translated roughly as mountain copper, it's possible that it was a form of brass, if you will. But yeah, I'll leave you to think about that. Maybe you'll share your opinions when it comes to that. But of course, another option would be to still use iron equipment, but tin it specifically. And for example, my replica of my lorica segmentata that usually you see in the background there, that one has been completely covered in liquid tin during production, specifically to avoid any form of rust. And we know that tinning was a technique that the Romans not only were capable of using, but that they did use, both in military context, but also when it comes to tools, artifacts, craftsmanship, and whatnot. But anyways, I'll leave you with that idea. And of course, let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.